Today is Friday, July 12th, 2024, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here with my podcast co-host and partner, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, how are we doing today?
Doing fantastic. Have a TWP on tomorrow. I'm very excited about that. I've been kind of running around making sure we got booklets and such, but very good and excited about our guest today. His presence always lifts my spirits and makes me feel a little bit giddy.
Should we announce him now or just refer to him as the friend of the podcast?
Well, we'll find out. Maybe he's going to give us some bad news. He's come to really, really hold us in disdain. Let's go ahead and announce him now. It's very nice to have with us Mr. Phil Sena, who is in town. Mr. Sena, do you want to say hi?
Thank you, Jake and Julia.
They haven't even played any music yet.
Oh, I got that wrong.
Now you said that. Let's go ahead and kick them up. And welcome back. I won't bother to thank Jake and Julia because Mr. Sena already did. Welcome to the podcast again. And I was not fibbing when I said that it leaves me a little bit giddy that Mr. Sena is here. It's always a pleasure to get to spend time with him. And today we are remembering Mr. Richard Ames. That's actually the reason you're in town, right?
That's right. For the funeral.
That's right. So we thought we'd say before we actually address Mr. Ames specifically that we'd highlight, there's a certain trend in society, and we've been talking about it. I know Mr. Weston, we've talked about it at lunch a bit in the past multiple times. There's kind of a trend in society to I don't know how to put it, not necessarily to disrespect the dead. I'm not saying that, but to not treat funerals and such as the somber and serious occasion that it is. You look at Solomon, he says that, boy, the house of mourning is a time to go and be and focus on larger and more important things. And there seems to be in society this desire to not think about death. Someone's died and you just want to have a quote unquote celebration of life and just, I get that in terms of wanting to think of, how wonderful it was to know this person. But at the same time, the fact is the Bible really does encourage holding people in a certain respect and honor even after they've died. And just having a party afterwards is not quite what it seems like God is really looking for. The fact is we're not animals. It's not like a puppy has died or something, or we're all just trying to remember all the fun time we had with Sparky and such. A human being is a carrier of the image of God. It is someone who has borne his image for whatever amount of time on earth. And God considers the death of a human being to be something of significance, such that in terms of the significance that human beings hold, even after their death, we maintain a certain kind of respect. And the example in Scripture I wanted to read as just one example of that, it's just one of the ones I like. In fact, Mr. Robinson had some insights about it the other day I thought were interesting, was about the bones of Joseph, how Joseph, being a son of Israel, a son of Jacob, and having been with the family alive when Israel went into Egypt, and then afterward, before he died, he actually made them promise that they would take his bones out of Egypt. Sure enough,
Jacob.
Oh, sorry, Jacob. Yeah, I'm saying Joseph. I'm sorry, Jacob. So no, it's the bones of Joseph. Did Jacob make that? Jacob make them do that promise? They took Joseph's bones out.
Well, that too. But they take the long funerary that's recorded in Genesis 50 is taking Jacob's
got
bones.
it. So, okay, we're thinking of two different occasions. Okay, I had in mind.
That makes sense.
No, but you might talk about that one because I do think that was significant. I'm thinking actually of Joseph first. Moses, it says in Exodus 13 and verse 19, did take Joseph's bones with them as they were leaving Egypt. And you might think, he didn't really know. Of course, Joseph didn't know. He was dead. He wouldn't have any idea. You could tell him later, now we left your bones there. We knew you wouldn't care, because we recognize we're not in heaven or hell. When we're dead, we are dead until the resurrection. And yet that respect for Joseph, where he had actually had them under oath saying that they would take his bones out of Egypt, they did that and they laid them to rest someplace else. So there's this sense of respect for someone. I don't know if they didn't take, as far as I know, any of the bones of their animals that died while they were there or anything like that, but there's something about human beings that is really different. What is the case concerning Jacob that you had in mind?
Well, the Jacob one was really interesting to me because clearly it was a big deal to not He did not want his bones left in Egypt. So you could just kind of leave the story at that. But Genesis tells a longer account of it and starts to tell about this procession that went, and people began to take note of it. I'll just read a little excerpt of it here. Should have left my glasses on for that. Let's see. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up to the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of the house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as the house of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's house. Only their little ones, their flocks and their herds, they left in the land of Goshen. And they went up with both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great gathering. Then they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, and they mourned there with a great and very solemn lamentation. He observed 7 days of mourning for his father, and when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a deep mourning in the Egyptians." Therefore his name was called Abel Mitzrim, which is beyond the Jordan. Anyway, I just thought it was very interesting that it wasn't just like a local event that had occurred. Like everybody in the area and the region knew about it. Everybody in Egypt knew about it. Everybody beyond the Egypt borders knew about it. And what does that mean for how notable Jacob was? And I have to feel like some of that is also associated to Joseph, because everybody had to know why they weathered the famine of 7 years because of Joseph. Well, obviously God inspired him, but Joseph putting the grain away, and everybody remembered that, it seems. And
right.
So, but and it made me think about, is the Bible written about some backwater tribe that nobody knew about? No, because you think about the story of the Exodus, and that everybody knew what happened there with Moses, but even moving on, you have Jonah going to the Assyrians. You have Nebuchadnezzar himself making a proclamation about the God of Israel, and the Romans and the Persians, and every large and world ruling empire that we can think of had a very direct witness to it by somebody notable from the tribe of Israel.
Yeah, that's anyway. I think it's really neat. We're not talking about going so far as like the old Indian practice of sati and sacrificing essentially, to the dead person, the wife, the widow having to die in the flames as well. We're not talking about that, but we're also talking about not the other ditch where it's like, oh, I don't want to think about death. It's just too sad. I want to focus on life. Well, no, it is significant when a human being dies and then that life comes to an end awaiting a resurrection, and it should have some weight to it.
I have a very short memory story about that. When Mr. Bonjour died, which was actually pretty unexpected, I would say. He was older, but that we didn't expect it that just like that. That you weren't down here for that. Mm-hmm. Mr. Smith and I were here for the funeral, and we were outside, and it wasn't the best weather. It was okay. It was fine, but it really struck me how a group of 200 people stood there in absolute silence for like 10 minutes or 15 minutes. I just remember the presence of the crowd had such a reverence for this man who died in the faith, and that people, it doesn't seem people can ever be completely quiet, and there was this large group of people just absolutely silent. Kind of reminded me of Passover in that regard a little bit.
Yeah, a somberness.
Yes,
because it should mean something. And we don't mean to belabor this point before we go into the things that we wanted to do. We just wanted to spend some time talking about Mr. Ames and some memories of him. But at the same time, I don't want to keep you from making any comments, Mr. Sena. Do you have any observations on these preliminary thoughts?
Well, I just wanted to ask Mr. Robinson, did you cite the verse on that? I didn't catch it.
I probably didn't.
It's in Genesis 50, right?
Yep.
Is it Genesis 50?
The passage is in Genesis 50.
It started in verse 7.
Okay. All right. Just for our listeners
I
who may
appreciate that.
Yeah, you never know.
Yep.
Yep.
Sometimes it's an exercise for the listener to find what we're talking about. You did say Genesis 50 earlier in your comments. That's how I was able to find it.
All right. Okay. No, I have nothing to add to that.
No, we were just too brilliant, Mr.
No, I'm blown away.
That's why he's a friend of the podcast.
That's why he's a friend of the podcast. That's nice. Okay, well, then we did want to spend today then with such a mindset to reflect on Mr. Ames. We all have had a relationship with him. Mr. Robinson and I, as a working relationship, Mr. Robinson revised in a dramatic way in 2013 the look of the Tomorrow's World magazine. In fact, if you go on the livingyouth.org website, which by the way I should mention, if you're interested in camp, we are posting photos. We won't post for the Sabbath, but we're posting photos from camp every day on the Living Youth podcast. So I think by the end of today, there'll be 4 or 5 posted pictures. But anyway, if you go out there, I think when the anniversary came, the 25th anniversary, I posted an illustration, like the first one that you did, Mr. Robinson, to kind of show the brand new look. So he's been working with Mr. Ames directly in the editorial department. From that point, I worked with him in fact, it was Mr. Ames who actually emailed me to tell me I was added to the telecast. I remember. So from working on the telecast and trying to just learn from him and get advice from him. So that goes back to 2006, I suppose, whenever I was added. But then Mr. Sena is actually a part of the family. So you've been interacting with him for quite a time.
Actually, I first knew him, had interaction with him when I was a student at Ambassador College in 1982. He was transferred to Big Sandy where I was a sophomore, and that's where I first encountered him and got to know him just a little bit. I mean, it was just as a student and teacher relationship. I didn't really have that many interactions with him. And I just remember having the impression of him being stern and humorless. But then when I got to be a part of the family through marriage, then I saw a totally different side of him, and those are the kinds of things that I will remember about him.
It's funny you said humorless because when he's in charge, I mean he's in charge, and one of the things that I want to make sure I mention for those who haven't had a chance to interact with him is he actually did have a good sense of humor, and sometimes when he would laugh, I made a note to make sure I described it this way. It was like one of those whole face kind of laughs. I mean, really, when something just tickled his funny bone, he just loved it, and I always really enjoyed being able to finally, say something here and there, something humorous that would make him laugh. He'd be kind of a target because I just loved watching Mr. Ames laugh. And in terms of, stern, very, he had high standards. I know. I relayed this story before we started recording, but my very first split sermon in the Dallas, Texas congregation, way back when Mr. Ames was there, he was visiting, and he was a guest there for the Days of Unleavened Bread, and he had spoken in the AM, so our split sermons were in the PM. So he got to hear my first one, which, by the way, really was terrible. It was not great. After I was added to the ministry, I decided to turn that and adapt it for a sermon. And I found it was too much material for a sermon. So you can only imagine what it was for a split. I didn't even realize it at the time. It was terrible. But afterwards, after the sundown, we'd all gone out to a local steak place, just to fellowship before Mr. Ames had to leave. And we're leaving that evening. And Mr. Ames says, well, Wally, if you feel brave enough, feel free to ask me for a critique of your message today. And I said, oh, yeah, I will do that, Mr. Ames. And I did email him not long after, and I never really heard back, which Mr. Robinson taught me early on that, one of the signs Mr. Ames really knows you can take it and respects you is he'll give you feedback, you know. And he probably didn't know me all that well at that point. There was only one other interaction I could think of that I'll mention later, where he just didn't. As I'm not the guy that's going to fold and crumble under his critique, because I gave him a lot of material to work with for sure.
So when we were you mentioned redesigning the magazine, we were updating the look, and I had mocked up all these covers, and I don't remember why Bill Bomer, who was the executive editor at the time, was not there. But I had them all spread out, and I showed them to Mr. Ames, and he was very direct with his feedback. So much so that I was not sure how to take it, because I don't know, does he hate these? What does this mean? And then it was actually Bill Bomer that tipped me off. He said, oh, no, that means he feels like you could take the critique.
Good.
So it was kind of a sign of respect. So after that, it was fine. I really have no problem with feedback that's direct when I know that there's no animus behind it. It's just the facts. This is just what I think of. It's very straightforward.
He cared so passionately about the magazine and the quality of the magazine and such. So he was very invested in terms of the look and such. And I think he was among those who were really proud of it when you did, kind of revise the look and modernize it and such. It seemed like he was always really, really happy with it. So in terms of personal recollections, we don't really have a lot of structure to this. We're going to do our best. Mr. Sena's here, so we're going to be far more ordered and structured perhaps than normal, and really be on our best behavior. But one I wanted to share, at least an aspect of Mr. Ames was, we've already talked about getting feedback. So I'll tell 2 feedback stories, because I've learned that this is going to sound really odd, but one, it's very masculine to be able to give and take critique. It's a characteristic. Spokesman Club teaches you to do that. The Spokesman Club will be important for one of the two little stories. One of the ways Mr. Ames helped me, it was, so I was here for, I don't think I was, oh yes, I was here. I transferred here. So I was already at headquarters, but my sons were still small. You know what? Actually, I don't think I'd transferred because they were small enough that they would make this mistake. And so usually when you would come, you'd find an office to work in if you're visiting. So he came into my office or something where I was borrowing. And so I had taped a telecast. Now, half the time or so, my kids and wife didn't come with me because it's just expensive. So I would fly in. But every once in a while I would drive so it could be cheaper and so they could be here too because I want the kids to have a chance to see Daddy work. But I would never fly them because that's expensive. So this was time when we drove, and so the kids could be there. So I'm recording in the studio, and the boys are watching, and then eventually it's all done, and we go back to wherever the kids go back to where my wife is staying, and I'm getting some work done at the office. Well, Mr. Ames comes in. Well, I know Mr. Ames, back then, he would come to see a little bit, at least, of every single telecast taping. Whether it was me or Dr. Meredith or Mr. King, later Mr. West, he would show up and he would come into the control room and he would watch part of it, just kind of check on everything because, again, the quality was very important to him. Well, he came to my office and said, oh, I saw part of your taping today. It was wonderful. Oh, it was so good. I appreciate how you covered that topic. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ames. He said, your children were there. I said, oh, I know. They, it's nice to have them, see me work here and there. And he said, yes. And, they were all sort of piled in the only chair in the control room. And you just might note for future, he was very gentle about it. You might just note for future purposes that, and we talked about honoring the elderly. Maybe I told this story. I don't think I did on the podcast then, but he said, you might let them know that if an older gentleman or older lady comes into a room and they have the only chair, they might want to get up, So I said, oh, Mr. Ames, I'm so sorry. But here's the thing. It's easy to think, oh, he shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't have said anything. No, that's the opposite of the case. Not only young parents in the church, but our children as well. We're counting on the older brethren to help us notice things and help us see things. And it might seem like, because he was not pushy, he was not ugly, he was kind. It was honestly is part of what made him a father figure in many ways, to me. The fact that he shared that, and I shared it with the boys. I did not get on. I locked them in their room. I didn't do that. I said, hey guys, do y'all remember when Mr. Ames came in? Well, just so you know, when you have an opportunity like that, the Bible says to honor the hoary head. We need to make sure that. And to this day, whenever I'm an opportunity to see it, which I'm not always, but sometimes they're in my office and someone comes in, Mr. Weston or someone, I see them stand up if it's an older person, and do that. But why do they do that? And why is that a part of their practice now? Because their dad was failing there. It's because Mr. Ames took the time to say it. And so he did that one just like he did the other one I'll mention. And this is one of my favorite stories about Mr. Ames guiding me. I'd given a sermon here in Charlotte. In fact, you could find it online. It was an old one on trumpets. I was trying to talk about John's vision and what it was like to experience that. So Mr. Ames comes into my office. And by then I was working here. And he starts off the same way. Classic Spokesman Club every time. If you've ever been in Spokesman Club, and you young men that are teens out there, we look forward to you being in Spokesman Club one day. They talk about giving some positive comments first and then giving your critique about what can be improved, but then, trying to end positively. So Mr. Ames comes in my office and says, oh, Wally, I was listening to the recording of your sermon on trumpets and it was so good. I don't think I'll really think about John's vision the same way again. It was just vibrant and really brought it to life. And, oh, thank you, Mr. Ames. I appreciate it. He says, but why don't you come in my office for a minute? I want you to listen to something. I said, sure. Okay. But I realized at this point, okay, I'm going to find out what I did wrong. And he had it queued up. He had Windows Media Player and he had the recording and he had it queued. He said, no, listen to how you say this one part. And he played it. And it was a part where I was trying to say that, John was overwhelmed in his vision. He was like, oh, I made this noise like, oh, and he stopped it there and said, that's not a comfortable sound to hear. It's just a weird noise. It's not great behind the lens. It says, in fact, listen to it again. And I'm not kidding. He literally played it over like, like, he just played it. It was like one after the other. I mean, I don't think he knew what the word trolling was, but that was about, he was really messing with me. And he said, and I said, thank you, Mr. Ames. I really appreciate that. But then he ended, but it really was very good and classic Spokesman Club. But that's one of the things that I really appreciate about being at headquarters in general was not just being able to get more feedback from other ministers or hear your sermons like Mr. Weston, but Mr. Ames in particular, who is just such a consummate professional and effective speaker, to have him invested enough and willing to not just say complain about, did you hear that the way Wally made that noise, in the sermon, but literally to actually tell you and try to help you. It was anyway. So those are some of my favorite memories.
Well, you mentioned Spokesman's Club, and one of my favorite memories, this did not happen to me, but a friend of mine was telling me that same year that he was in Big Sandy when I was a sophomore, and my friend was talking to him about Spokesman's Club, and he was just talking like, almost all of us said Spokesman's Club, and Mr. Ames says, "What did you say?" And Spokesman's Club. He said, look at the manual. And what does it say? Spokesman Club.
Singular.
Yes. And I've remembered that ever since. Even though that didn't happen to me, I've always been very careful to say that, especially around him.
Yeah, he caught me early on. I can't remember the first time I used the reference in the telecast. I said, it says Zechariah. I said Zachariah. Mm-hmm. And he said, a lot of people listening aren't from Texas. You need to be careful. So but again, I never felt, because I know the reputation he had from college, right? Mm-hmm. But honestly, never really felt crushed by it or something. But at the same time, very, very, it's the kind of stuff where you didn't have to question what he was saying. He was plain about it to try to help you be better.
Well, along these lines, this is one of the things I wanted to talk about because later, a few years later after that, when I was a junior at Ambassador College, he was my homiletics teacher. Homiletics is teaching more sermonette, more sermon type speaking. And he was my lab instructor. So we would give actual sermonettes in class. And I have to say, well, let me go back. The previous semester, I was with Mr. Meredith in his class, and I didn't do very well in there at all. In fact, I transferred to Mr. Ames's because I didn't do well in Mr. Meredith's. Funny that I ended up being his son-in-law.
Yeah.
But in Mr. Ames's class, I thrived, and it was because of that combination of encouragement, a lot of encouragement, but also a stickler for the precision that's necessary to be a good, clear speaker. And that stayed with me. In fact, I had him 2 years in a row, and it was fantastic. He probably helped me more than anyone in my speaking. And it just, I'll never be able to thank him enough for that, because it really has been so valuable in not only how I speak, but how I hear others speak. And it's helped me as a pastor to train those who are under me, learning how to give sermonettes. In fact, it's how he tailored homiletics class is exactly how I tailor homiletics class in our congregations.
Really?
Exactly the same format, where you get up and then you open it up to comments from all the other men, and then I give my final evaluation. And that's how he did class. And I just learned so much from that. Now, one thing we also did was we videotaped ourselves. And that was very instructive as well. I don't have the men do that, but it's very, very helpful to do that. But because he was so good at details and precision of language and speaking and diction and all of those things, enunciation, I learned so much from him because of that.
Can you think of anybody that's benefited from your... I was sitting here thinking about how, we and I have talked about this before, but it's been a long time. And so this is kind of refreshing my brain a little bit. And so you could argue that in a sense, I directly benefited from that as well.
Exactly.
Because when you put me on the speaking schedule without asking me, I had only given, I think I'd given my third sermonette before you had heard enough, and it wasn't just me, just in general. Your sermonette guys around all your areas. You're like, hey, there's a lot of bad habits and things like that. I felt really blessed to have actually been so inexperienced when you did that, because I didn't have bad habits to unlearn.
Right.
I was more or less a blank slate. And I wanted to, if I was going to give sermonettes, I wanted to do it correctly, and I put myself into doing it properly. And you did it the way Mr. Ames taught you.
Exactly. He was my biggest influence in that, and I've just passed that along. So his legacy will continue, and through men like you.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's funny because I wasn't giving sermonettes long enough to think that having to limit it to 3 scriptures was a big deal. all the other guys was like, 3 scriptures? You mean like passages, right?
3 verses.
Three verses.
3 verses.
And to me, it really helped. It was one of the best ways, besides a tight SPS, of keeping your sermonette in an appropriate length and an appropriate topic. Because if you can only do 3 scriptures, 3 verses, I mean, that automatically limits what you're going to talk about. And I found that very helpful.
It focuses the message, yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, Mr. Ames was such an influence on me for that, and that I just thank him so much for what he did for me in that way.
Yeah, and he, it's funny. I only because you did, and we had talked about it. In my areas, I started trying to work with the sermonette fellas more. Came up with a little manual for them, trying to take from materials, and I think, what was it? Did your suggestion? I can't remember, but remember even narrowing them to one passage. Like, could you give a sermonette on just one? But to try to help them learn that the whole point is expounding the scriptures, not just reading the scriptures. But yeah, that's something that I think doesn't always go realized, is how far influence really is going to go. And Mr. Ames's influence will be large. Also, in terms of just an example, I've enjoyed here and there on Facebook. I'm not normally on Facebook that much, but I had occasion to go recently, and then sure enough, saw people commenting about Mr. Ames, just personal memories, posting photos they taken, and how many, Mr. Ames loved taking photos when he was out with people. He just loved capturing that picture. And reading those and being reminded of just how much time he enjoyed spending time with the brethren. He loved going out to eat after services, and he loved getting the time to fellowship. And there were a couple stories that I had about that I personally appreciate. They're fond memories for me. One was at the very first feast that I had ever run myself. That was Branson. Remember, I was going to be your assistant,
yes.
Mr. Sena.
Yes.
And you even told me before that, when you said, hey, why don't you come be my assistant? You never know when they're going to make you run one of these things. And they literally pulled me and made me run the first one in Branson. So I didn't have the opportunity to enjoy your leadership in the same way. It's just clearly a dark period of my life.
I'm sorry about that.
But Mr. Ames was the first speaker, I think. The first one was it? I do think I'm thinking, no. That was not the first one in Branson. Sorry. It was the first one, I think, at the new facility in Branson. The first one, Dr. Meredith was the guest. The second one, I think it was the second one, I had the Woolies, Mr. and Mrs. Woolies.
Yes.
I had them as my guest speaker liaison, and they were very good, just so you know. We were talking about how important that is right before the program. But there was one point, if they weren't the liaison then, maybe this is what made me think of it. But I used to, and I feel for this, I used to be intimidated about going up and talking to the minister, and let alone asking them out for dinner or something, right? Because I thought, they're really busy and they got more important people to talk to. Well, sure enough, it was the lunch break, I think, on a high day, and almost everybody was gone except for Mr. and Mrs. Ames and me and my family, because we were frequently, kind of slow to get out. And I went up to him and said, I imagine someone's asked you out, which I should have made sure. And he said, no, actually, no one had asked them. And I said, well, we're having sandwiches at the condo if you want to come. And they did. And we all just hung out at the condo making sandwiches. There's cold cuts out. It's all clean, of course, mayonnaise or whatever. And just making sandwiches with the Ameses. They weren't above something like that. And the idea of being intimidated to ask the ministry over for something like that, that really helped, is realize, well, no, just ask, right? They'd much rather spend time with God's people than make sure they go someplace fancy, because we were definitely not affording any place fancy. Well, I should have known better, because I had an earlier experience that's similar but different. And that was our first feast at Lake of the Ozarks, but well before we were in the ministry. Michael had just been born, so we're talking about 1999 or so. So this was a long time ago. They're at Lake of the Ozarks, and again, Mr. Ames and Mrs. Ames were guests there, and they were traveling to multiple sites. So they were about to leave Lake of the Ozarks to go someplace else. And my mother-in-law, and you're her pastor, my mother-in-law, Mr. Sena, she's far more forward than I would have been then. So all I know is she says that evening, she says, oh, well, I asked the Ameses if before they go to the airport, if they want to stop by and have breakfast at the condo. And I thought, Mom, what are you doing? I mean, he's busy and they got to get to the airport. Oh, I'm sure I was a big whiny baby, because especially me, I'm nervous about getting to the airport. I like to get there 18 hours early. I'm not early to everything, but airports, I like to be there early. And not only did they show up and just had our scrambled eggs, we made kind of homemade. We never gave them a big meal. We just gave them whatever we had on the table. But they did. They stopped by, as busy as they were. Instead of just going straight to the airport, trying to relax, they literally came and spent the morning with us at breakfast right before driving to the airport with our noisy little kids at the time. Sorry, Jonathan, Michael, but they were a little noisy. And that was a wonderful memory. And he contributed in both of those things, separated by some years. It contributed to my understanding, because even early in the ministry, I was still kind of awestruck to a certain extent. And even though I was in the ministry, still, some people were kind of at a distance. Yeah, here was someone who didn't have those kind of airs, who was happy to take off his jacket and sit down and slather some sour cream on a tortilla in his hand and put some ground beef in it. And I just appreciated that. So he loved being with God's people, and he loved the fellowship, and it was a good example for me. I can be a little bit of a hermit if I'm not careful, and Mr. Ames, he liked being with God's people.
Yeah, I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about his legacy, because from what I understand, what was his one thing he wanted to be known for, and it was turning many to righteousness. And listening to the various stories here, his work as an Ambassador College instructor. His work, it's easy to forget he was a field pastor for some time, and being a shepherd in that way. But probably his greatest overall influence was through being a telecast presenter. And, it made me, so this is where it's kind of a more personal observation for me. When we started attending Living in 99, and Mr. Ames was already here, although I don't know that he was at headquarters. It doesn't really matter. One of the things I found, especially once I was a minister and traveled around a little more, was how many people, because back then we were still closer to the worldwide collapse. And Mr. Ames was somebody that people remembered and recognized as being a part of the truth. They were like, I remember the telecast, back in the 80s. And then I saw Mr. Ames, and I thought, that's where the truth is. And I think one of the many things you could cite him for his legacy that he left behind was being a stable, well-known figure who just relentlessly preached God's truth, and people recognized him. I think there's probably a lot of people still, I would guess, in Living Church of God that are here in part because they remembered Mr. Ames.
I think that's so true. I encounter people all the time who, many of them, were listening to the telecast back in Worldwide, when it was Worldwide Church of God, and he was one of the presenters. And exactly what you're saying, they saw Mr. Ames once again and thought, oh, there's the truth, or there's that message again. And it has drawn them in. And I know that has been a major, who knows? Who knows how many thousands perhaps who have been influenced in a positive way directly because of God using Mr. Ames in that capacity. Going back to the Worldwide Church of God, he was one of the original 3 presenters after Mr. Armstrong's death, and in 1986, and that goes back a long ways. Who knows how many hours? And then all the articles and booklets, and all those things that his legacy will continue, because those things will still be available.
Pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it is remarkable. And so exactly that scripture in Daniel, I believe he's definitely fulfilled that.
Yes.
And God has used him powerfully in that way.
You know, I just on a hunch based on the way the conversation was going, I pulled up some of the letters that are sent in digitally that I could look up real quickly. And sure enough, it did not take long before I was able to find some comments about some things that Mr. Ames had written. One of them, someone wrote, and this person might actually be in the church based on the language. It's hard to say because these are anonymized. But someone wrote, "Dear Mr. Ames, your article, Planet Earth," which is actually looks like this other one comments about the same article, was so complete. If I had never read another article from the church, your article says it all, complete. It was perfect. You covered everything. Thank you. I will keep this article and read it again and again. And then she adds, I'm 92, can't walk, can't see, can't hear. I love God and I am happy. So, yeah. But then this one is interesting too. This, someone wrote who does not seem to be in the church. And someone wrote, hello, I've been receiving your magazine for several years now. Always useful. I share it with others. Your article, Planet Earth, Your Inheritance, is the best article ever. Mr. Ames presents the information in a concise, logical, and straightforward way, the best for this topic I have ever read over my lifetime. As a student of eschatology, which means end time things, as a student of eschatology over decades, this is the first time the subject of where we end up and when has been presented in a cogent way and with scriptural references all the way through. Thank you. He just was clear, in that kind of way and cared a lot about these things. And I would say cared enough to return to the topics from time to time. Sometimes we get kind of caught up and excited, want to write about something new, but Mr. Ames knew things that were important and wanted to communicate. I can't help myself to note that the letter right after that has the statement, Wallace G. Smith knew very little on this subject. It's one about the Earth being round. It's written by someone who clearly is a flat earther.
There's a conspiracy about that. I can understand why you think it's round. We're joking. We're joking.
We are joking. That's right.
That woman being 92 reminded me of another thing that hit me in the last few, like I say, last month. So Mr. Ames had turned 88 when he died.
Yes,
and so it made me think. Because he worked up to the very end of his life. Yes. He had an assignment to travel to Raleigh for the Days of Unleavened Bread. He did that. That's when his health really took a turn, and he had to come back, and he went into the hospital. But it made me think. So because I'm in my 50s now, and I start thinking, the idea of a retirement doesn't sound too bad. What did Mr. Ames do when he turned 87? He rolled up his sleeves and did a full slate of telecasts. For the season of 2023, and he worked up to the end of his life. It's incredible.
That is about as close to dying with our boots on as I think we can hope to do. And and really was, so many of the letters that we do get are handwritten here and there still. And I remember Mr. Ames would sometimes I've got to have copies of them for the magazine, or sometimes Mr. Ames might ask me to work with the response because he would get a lot. And I remember just reading one. It was one that it's too easy to think, oh, well, is that really an important topic? It wasn't about prophecy or something. It was one because he loved talking about what to do to have peace in your life, about prayer, and about how to get over stress. And I remember one of his as the editor seeing Mr. Ames, he turned in one of the stress articles about how to deal with stress. I thought, well, this is good. I thought this is really good that we publish stuff like this. This is helpful, but it didn't strike me as actually kind of a standout article, right? It's like, I'm not trying to besmirch it. I'm trying to besmirch me, maybe. I realized, well, no, there's good concrete lessons here for people, but it didn't really I didn't think it stood out, in that particular issue. But man, we got a letter from someone, and I can't remember the details, and it was a physical letter, so it's harder for me to find. But that individual went on about how they had been, like at the end of their rope, and things were just so stressful and so intense in their lives and their life. And then hear this article from Mr. Ames. They read it and they saw the practical advice that he was giving about how to get rid of this stress in your life. And he was writing to Mr. Ames to say just how life-changing that article was, how it turned everything, which I would give, of course, credit to God.
Mm-hmm.
God used Mr. Ames's article to really turn this guy's life around. And he was so appreciative, that he wrote this letter. And I thought truly Mr. Ames's desire to hopefully be accounted for as a person who had turned many to righteousness, I can't wait to know that he will come up in the resurrection and have the opportunity to see just how many that is. Yeah.
He was a wonderful man. I can't help but think of all the personal encounters that I've had with him, because whenever we come to Charlotte, we normally stay at their home. And so we've had many, many hours to enjoy. And one of the things that when we first started going there, that I was shocked the first time he did this. I had no idea he ever did anything like this, but we were getting ready to go to services, and his practice while he was waiting for Aunt Catherine was to play the piano. And I think I have a recording somewhere of him playing the piano, but it was not just playing the piano. He could have been a lounge pianist. I mean, it was, and he was playing, jazz chords and everything. And I would say, that's amazing. How do you, he would just laugh it off like, oh, that's nothing. And then you'd hear a melody, a famous melody. It was very, very impressive. But that was just another one of the things that he was good at and could do, but it wasn't emphasized at all, because really the work was the most important thing to him, always up to the end. And your story, Mr. Robinson, made me think of one of the things that he would do if he couldn't sleep was he would go through where he was, where the feast sites that he attended, and he could cite, you just say any year, he could tell you exactly right then and there which feast, which sometimes had 3 or 4.
Wow.
He would know them all. And that I learned a lesson from that his mind was always active. And that's the thing with his body, you could tell was breaking down, but his mind was still sharp. Yeah. And I would think, times when we would stay there, he'd be so frail. But then we would sit down and start talking, and it was like all that went away, because he would be talking about, what's going on in the work and other things. And you could just see the light, and it was just like you were talking to him 30 years ago.
So that does remind me of another story. I was very impressed by his recall and his memory, and I realized it wasn't just that he was good at that, because I do think he did. I think he had a mind for it, but he was very active about it.
Yes.
Like you said, going through and reviewing it. So one time I went down to his office, just when it was still downstairs. I asked him, some tips on how to memorize things. And his answer kind of caught me off guard, because he said, well, first you have to want to memorize things. Something like that. And I thought, I need to actually be committed to this, is what you're saying. There's not some parlor trick to remembering everything. And so after that, I just gave up on remembering things.
Well, maybe we ought to wrap up. One, thank you, Mr. Sena, for being here and for taking the time on your trip.
Allowing me to do this, because I'm going to miss him very much, and very much a privilege of being part of the family these last 32 years. And I remember the first time, because, those days at Ambassador College, he was always Mr. Ames, Ames, And I remember the first family dinner I was invited to, and it was my evaluation dinner. They were evaluating me, and he was there, as he was with all of them. And I remember him specifically commanding me. He says, "I command you to call me Uncle Dick." And I was like, "I can't do that, Mr. Ames." And he says, "I command you to call me Uncle Dick." "Okay, Uncle Dick." And so ever since that time, he was Uncle Dick. And it was such a privilege to know him on a personal level like that, and just really learned so much from him, and we'll definitely miss him.
Smith and Robinson.